Thank you everyone for joining. I think this is a super interesting topic and very relevant for the moment. Given the times that we're in now with inflation and everything else going on in the market, certainly CEOs and CFOs are focused on cost management. And I think there's a lot of traditional approaches most of us have experience with and how this can be done. But whether or not it's effective or whether or not it's the only approach or even the best approach remains to be seen. And that's why I'm really happy to be having this conversation in terms of how we can think about cost management from an analytics approach and in using AI and how to accomplish this. And during this webinar, we will discuss limitations on the traditional approach and perhaps some new approaches to how this could be done. So with that, I would like to launch into the conversation, and I'd like to turn over to Greg, Larry, and Robert, perhaps in that order, to introduce yourself, please. So Greg,
Sure.
over to you.
Absolutely, Erin. And first of all, thank you to the Financial Executives Networking Group, FANG, for hosting us. Really appreciate that and the time you personally, Erin, have invested with us to pull this together. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So Greg Dadarian, I'm managing partner at Aegis Advisory Partners. We're a strategy management consulting firm focused in and on the finance function. My personal background is over the last 30 years, I've spent focused around finance, both from an industry perspective and as an advisor to the industry professionals. Everything from kind of front-end finance strategy through finance execution and all the components therein, and a keen focus right now around process and the experience angle that firms are looking for. So again, thank you for having me.
Yeah, hi, I'm Larry Maisel, and I'm delighted to be here with you today to share our perspective on analytics-driven cost management. By background, I started my career at KPMG, and I left as a senior partner in the KPMG consulting business. I've been involved as a vice president of finance, as a CFO, and I've also been involved with Balanced Scorecard Collaborative. I've worked for Oracle and a number of other private companies, particularly those in the financial services, pharmaceutical, and media industries. A few years ago, I was teaching strategy and performance management at Columbia Business School. I am an avid golfer, but most importantly, I am a husband and a father and a brother and a son to a wonderful, wonderful family.
Thank you, Larry. I'm Robert Zwirling, and you'll notice that my last name begins with a Z, and therefore I go last. I've had to deal with this my entire life.
The best for last, Robert.
That's my cushion. We'll go with that. So again, thank you, Erin, for everything here. Thanks for the attendees for being here. I have a 25-year plus history as a serial entrepreneur, companies across manufacturing, distribution, telecommunication, utilities, analytics, and artificial intelligence. Today, I sit with my feet in two different companies. One is Aurora Predictions, where we have software, AI-enabled analytics software designed for the business user, so you don't need to have IT support, or you don't need data science or statistics skills. And the other foot is in the Finance Analytics Institute, where we teach how to implement analytics. And we do that through white papers, books. Two of the books are here that you can see, Implementing an Analytics Culture for Data-Driven Decision. In fact, that book really launched the product at Aurora. And then the one that Larry and I and our other co-author, Jesper Sorensen, just wrote, brilliant piece, groundbreaking, definitive work on AI-enabled analytics for business, where we again talk to how to implement analytics. And that's my background.
So thank you for that, Greg and Larry and Robert. For myself, I am a CFO of 20 some odd years, focused on financial service firms. I've worked across a variety of business models, primarily in asset, wealth, investment management, private banking, retail brokerage, in both project roles and line roles. So I thought we would start with a couple of icebreaker questions. And first question, maybe we could answer in the same order as we introduced ourselves. If you could have dinner with anyone, living or dead, who would it be and why? So Greg, your shot.
Sure. Thought about this, and my answer is actually I'd love to have dinner with my two grandfathers. Unfortunately, they both predeceased my birth, so I never got to know them. And I really would love to kind of get their views of the world, where it is today compared to where they came from, and what they would share with me about becoming a better person.
Yeah, Greg, very nice. I wish, well, first of all, I have to say, other than my wife, of course, Erin.
Of course,
But
of course, she's always number one.
yeah, but thinking about it, it's a great question. I thought about it would be really wonderful to sit with Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, two different sides of the political spectrum, not only because of their worldview of what's going on today, but both of them had a terrific sense of humor. So to me, having dinner with them would be a fabulous evening.
I might have to horn in on that dinner.
You'd be more than welcome. We need someone to pick up the check.
Well, then we should invite Robert.
See what the guy that goes last, he's got to take the check too. This is just punishing. So since it's anyone, I'd pick God. No explanation necessary. So there you go.
There you go. And for myself, if I were to pick, I've often thought I would love to have dinner with my father-in-law and St. Joseph. So my father-in-law, because he died right before I met my husband, and my mother-in-law swears that he died, went to heaven, and went searching to find me and bring me to the family for a son. And the other, St. Joseph. So probably similar along the lines of you, Robert, but I've got to imagine being St. Joseph and being the earthly father of Jesus, what a lesson in leadership that could be. So on to something a little bit lighter. I thought it would be interesting if we all shared what our first job was. So Greg, what was your first job?
So I grew up outside the Orlando, Florida area. And the company that's famous in Orlando, Florida is Disney World. My first job as a 16-year-old was working custodial services at Disney. So I bussed tables in the theme park.
Did you have to wear mouse ears as you did that?
I did not wear mouse ears, but everyone wore a costume. Absolutely.
So what was your costume? Tell us.
Well, it actually, so this is interesting. It was different by location that you were working. So if you were working in Tomorrowland, you had the futuristic kind of costume. If you were working over in Liberty Hall, you had more of a swashbuckling, classic colonial type costume.
And what was your favorite?
Tomorrowland was fun to work in, except it got really, really crowded in the summer.
I can imagine. Larry, what was your first job?
I actually was trying to remember, and I was working on the intersection of Wall and Beaver. So those of you who are familiar with the Wall Street area of Manhattan know that intersection, and right directly across the street from Delmonico's was a little over-the-counter brokerage firm. And that was my first job, keeping the position sheets, pink sheets, as we used to call them.
I remember the pink sheets.
And just beginning to learn the brokerage business. So it was a job. It was done as a summer intern. I don't even know if they called them interns. It was a summer job, and it was a great first experience.
Good for you. You started high end from the beginning.
Well, I didn't have ears to mouse ears at the time.
You had helicopter ears working there.
Yeah.
And Robert, for
Robert,
you?
you go.
Well, I mean, I had to think about this because it was like, what was it my first legal job? Or so all kidding aside, have been working since as long as I can remember as a kid. I mean, I've been an entrepreneur since a kid, washing cars, mowing lawns, laying stone, painting, cabinetry, and whatever. Eventually, I worked my way up to be a lifeguard. Then I didn't have to do the laborious work. I could
And
stay
you got
out.
a good tan at the same time.
I did both, but I've been working. I can't remember a time I wasn't working and doing something.
So I actually started working at the Middle Country Public Library in their back office, where I was responsible for all sorts of activities. That was back in the day when we used to have the card catalogs and we used to have a ton of books, and before, the idea of an electronic book was even born. So lugging the big books around, putting them back. We even had a whole video collection. They had one of the largest for rent video collections, almost as big as Blockbuster back in the day when Blockbuster was a business. So with that, I think, thank you for joining me in the icebreaker questions. I think it would be great to move to the topic that everyone signed up for. And just as an administrative matter, I would encourage everyone to ask questions via the chat function while we're going through. I think the guys have so much information to share with us. I'd like for us to be able to get through the presentation. And at the end, feel free to, when we get to Q&A, we'll leave time to unmute yourself and ask directly, or to submit in the chat function, and I'm happy to ask those questions. So with that, I will turn it over to Greg and Larry and Robert.
Thank you, Aaron, and I'll pick it up. And in thinking about this session, each of us recognize that we're living in an era of unprecedented events going on. Not only inflation, supply chain chaos, a pandemic that we still have not gotten total control over. We have shortages that, at least in this country, are unheard of. So it was interesting that when we got together to think about what would be a valuable topic, I think almost immediately, and as Robert likes to say, we almost became of one mind, and that cost management became the topic that we should talk about. Greg, if you just keep going. And so we thought about review why traditional cost management fails, because we know that doesn't work. There's too many, our own experiences, plus a number of surveys by McKinsey and other firms, Deloitte, demonstrate that at the end of the day, traditional cost management fails. I think hopefully, if many of us have been on one side or the other of that equation. And so we said, given our experience in analytics-driven activities, could we not think about how we would apply analytics-driven cost management? And we have some use cases that share what we've done, how we've done it, and the value of what came out of that process. And so one of the things we want to do in this webinar is to introduce not the concept of demand planning, but how demand planning is very critical to go with analytics-driven cost management. Then to share a roadmap. How do you implement it? What's the how-to? Is this a 18-month transformation, or is it a 6 to 8 week process? I think we'll give you some sharing of that experience. And at the end, and most important, show me the money. Where is the value to doing this? And hopefully, as we go through, we will have demonstrated that to each of you. And please, as Aaron mentioned, ask questions, share your own perspective, because a group like this and a senior group really can add to everyone else's understanding of the topic. We go to the next slide. So what is traditional cost management? First of all, you got the approach, which is low-hanging fruit. Let's go to the line item targets. Well, most of the time, that does not really impact structural change. If it does, the studies say it's not sustainable. The other way of going to traditional cost management is, let's put a hiring freeze. Let's go for a reduction in force and RIF. But what happens is, a lot of times, that's as the expression, it's more of a cleaver than a surgical instrument. And so what happens is that you have an awful lot of unintended consequences when you go through hiring freezes or headcount reductions. Not that you've made bad decision on the reduction, but things change. And so you need to be able to respond to that change. Next, we have is the absolute cost reduction target. Well, quite frankly, this is about gut feel. What is the right level that needs to be done? And I think the last and most, I think the most difficult and dangerous is that it's disconnected from your growth agenda. It's almost as if they're in separate silos. And that can be very disastrous. An example, for example, is customer service. If we were to cut customer service, how does that impact our customer-centric experiences? Greg, are you going to share the quote?
I have it up on the screen. This is from actually a friend who works in a global financial technology company, and he actually brought this up to me. We were sitting down, and he said he literally just blurted this out. That he was so frustrated because he was going through a cost reduction exercise, and I of course probed on that. And he said, you know, we've been going through all this detail about my team, the expense profile, and they don't get what we do. They don't understand the relationship and the fact that I have client services people that actually generate revenue for the company. And if we knock them down, you know, we have the ability to, or the ability to actually decrease our revenue as opposed to growing our revenue. So it was a very frustrating experience for that person.
Thanks, Greg. Let's go to the next slide, because I'm going to just quickly, not surprising, 86% of respondents to different surveys that we've seen undertake cost reduction initiatives, and they tend to be quite modest. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that only nearly half are pursuing targets of less than 10%. And as you can see in the upper left, that is fairly consistent in different regions of the world. So it's not a US thing or an APAC thing. It's pretty consistent. But if we go to the next slide, this is the wow. 63% fail to achieve that modest goal. Modest goal is less than 10%. Just to build on that, there are studies that say that 90% of cost reduction efforts are not sustained for 3 years or less. Think about that. What you started out to accomplish as a company, as an organization, is not sustainable. The cost creeps back in. So you haven't changed anything structurally, but you've gone through a lot of the difficulty of going through cost reduction. And in ways, cost reduction and cost management can be, in some ways, very synonymous. But we're thinking of cost management in a much larger context. If you will, the supply side of the business versus the revenue side. So why is cost management so important? First of all, we're looking at the supply chain constraints and the rising prices are going on. I saw an article in Fortune magazine recently that said in Shanghai is the largest container port in the world. And yet it's been shut down since late March. 1/5 of all cargo ships in the world today are stranded in port. This is creating significant supply chain disruptions, as we all know. Even I tease with Robert. I say, Robert, look out your window, because he's in California, and tell me how many ships are still in the Long Beach Harbor. It's an experience that we have not gone through in recent time. Thinking about deglobalization is one thing, but customer buying behaviors. I came across again a piece of information, not surprising, that 3/4 of users who use digital banking, that's online banking and mobile banking devices, and that's only going to grow. So there's a significant disruption in going about how customers, their buying behavior, whether it's financial services, banking services, or whatever is the actual item that the customer is thinking about. Things are changing dramatically. Next, Greg. And last, and certainly not least, is the whole notion of work environment and implications. It's not only that office buildings and hybrid work approaches, and office buildings are lots of space. I again saw an article recently that in London, they've converted an office building into luxury apartments. I think the issue here is that things have changed dramatically, and that you need a dramatic change to how you handle structural cost management. So what are we thinking about? Actively manage costs with targets without compromising your revenue, your product quality, your market reputation. Next is to bring insight, or as we say in the book, raise the level of analytical intelligence. And so you develop a DNA, a culture where insight is driven to drive decision making. And last is it's an ongoing process. It's not a one-off event. It's not done at the budget time. It's not done in the planning cycle. It is an ongoing, continuous process that needs to be managed effectively in order to achieve and sustain the kinds of positive results that are achievable. I'd like now to turn to Robert and to share with you some additional perspectives.
Thank you, Larry. So let's now go into the concept of what does this all mean? We talk about cost management, because we talk about cost reduction by itself. It ignores the revenue. And Larry started with the agenda talking about demand planning. So there is in North America a $242 billion, and that's on the low end, problem. $242 billion is lost across industry due to errors, due to wasted labor, and under-optimized planning. And this is despite the fact that businesses spend $500 billion, that's $500 billion, $500 billion a year on state-of-the-art enterprise software to cover everything. So you have your ERP systems, your CRM systems, your inventory, demand planning, BI tools, and so on and so forth. All this money is spent every year on software, enterprise software, and yet the state of the art, we're still underperforming by $242 billion that's being left on the table. And it all starts from the demand plan. If you look at the demand forecast error, the average demand forecast error runs from about 20% to 42%. So on average, about 35% demand forecast error, which cascades through the entire chain. So that error creates buffer stock, 20% of buffer stock, excess buffer stock. It creates 20% excess finished inventory goods. It creates 25% in excess and obsolete inventory. And on top of all the excesses, we still find ourselves with stockouts because we didn't get the demand right to start with. So you cannot just look at cost by itself. Cost has to be driven from demand. And if you get the demand wrong, then everything that's downstream follows it. And the solution is new AI-enabled analytics software that's come about really in the last 5 years or so that can enable us to deep dive into data, discover patterns, and make predictions on both the demand side, the revenue, the top line side, the cost side, because I need to know how much materials I need, because you plan, you source, you build, and you deliver. And that's all a chain. So we can't look at one part of the equation without the others. And now AI-enabled analytics allows us to do things we have not done and cannot do with all the other enterprise software we have out there today. Back to you.
So one of the things we want to talk about is start to head towards the how. How do we address this? I think what you've just heard through Robert's example is that building this analytics understanding of your cost is not a one-off exercise. We're really talking about changing the culture within firms to make cost management, business insight, a day-to-day element of your operation, right? And so our focus here is how do we help organizations build this capability to provide the kinds of insights you need to make decisions to avoid situations like Robert described around waste as an example. Today, the tools and the business understanding are available to help make this happen. And so what do we think we need to do? So number one, we want to think about developing an analytics-driven approach. And you'll see an important word here. We want to mitigate bias. If you think about the traditional approaches where you undertake a headcount reduction or you go for a line item expense reduction, those are most often done based on gut feel, your instincts, where you think you won't hurt yourself the most. What we're proposing here is by using analytics, so using mathematics, we want to remove that instinct aspect from the equation and make it much more factual. You certainly need to start with hypothesis around what drives revenue, what drives profit margin, hence what's the cost side of the equation, and really think about bringing that together, validating that hypothesis using statistical analysis techniques so that you can make informed business decisions as you move forward. So we talk about having a holistic view of your financial performance. So bringing together both pieces. So how does demand planning connect with the cost, right? Demand planning drives revenue. When you think about the asset management space, we want to acquire accounts. We want to open new accounts to grow our business, but we have to maintain those accounts. We have to service those accounts, and we have to occasionally retire those accounts. As we look at those from a cost perspective, so I use the word accounts every time, But when I think about services, I think about transactions. That's my bias. My bias is saying when I open an account, opening the account is the driver of cost. I have to open this account. I have to do certain activity. That could be correct, but I want to validate that relationship. Perhaps there are other actions or activities or drivers that would influence the cost part of the equation. So we're suggesting that you measure and validate your business drivers. So the hypothesis you've put forward that tie the revenue with the expense so that you can make informed decisions to better manage your overall cost equation. The graph on the left is a simple way to think about how to apply this concept. And so the axes are propensity to close. So we're thinking about new business here, and revenue quality. Revenue quality, I would think of as profit margin, but you also will likely factor in size of opportunity from a revenue perspective. In this model, an opportunity that is high propensity to close and high profit margin, you clearly want to harvest that. That's the green box. You want to go after that. But then as you learn more about the other opportunities, if we have a high opportunity to close something, but the quality is not good, I can start thinking about the actions necessary. Are there feature functions that this client wants around my account that I need to think about pricing a bit differently so I can move this account closer to the harvest side to improve the revenue quality? Also, if I have an opportunity where I see a pretty good profit margin play, but I'm not sure they're ready to close, what actions should I be taking to really convince and to persuade the client up the ladder to get to a close point? What things can we do to help make that happen? And then of course, we have the lower left-hand corner, which is, not likely to close, and it's not going to make us a lot of money. So we probably shouldn't be pursuing those very aggressively. It's a way of thinking about it, but the real point here is tying together the revenue and the expense, looking at it from a profit margin perspective, looking at other factors like the propensity to close to really inform what do we go do about these client opportunity situations. If we're able to do that, if we're able to put this capability in place, this really will lead to executing informed actions and start the process of changing the culture of the organization. This doesn't happen overnight, right? Organizations have to learn with this process. So you have to create that continuous learning environment and culture to really move forward. And so that's part and parcel of what we're thinking about when we talk about analytics-driven cost management. I was paging through Larry Roberts' book, and I thought this particular quote was actually pretty important. I think it really captures the essence that you need to build an information-based insight capability, which is what we're calling analytics-driven cost management here, and make it part of your day-to-day operations. If you think about going into COVID, if you had this capability going into COVID and business conditions started to change and you were able to start to validate your business drivers and you saw what was happening to your business drivers. So in my example of acquiring accounts, people were sheltering at home. Your normal process might have been face-to-face meetings to acquire these accounts. Now you had to think about alternatives. So how do I get a propensity to close for these accounts? So you have to think about, let's do a Zoom, let's do Teams, whatever your preferred technology platform is. And how do we connect with clients to try to bring them through? Well, thinking through and understanding the opportunity, the action, could have pointed you to different directions. And I think it's critically important here to really understand that relationship and make those decisions. And so what we're proposing is really to support that. And it's just a simple example. But in order to build it, let's get into a little bit of the how-to. So we've got a framework, an operating model framework that we use to define the approach. And this framework has three main components. It has the strategy. So what are we going to do? What are we setting out to do? What do we want to achieve? What's the purpose? What's the objectives, et cetera? Let's articulate that. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the results. What do we want the outcome and benefits to be? What do we want the experience of the constituents who are going to be looking at this cost information, looking at this performance information? How do we want to deliver it to them? How do we want them to interact with it? What kind of decisions should they be making? What decisions shouldn't they be making based on the information that you have? Then you have the other 7 components here. So people, organization, process, controls, data, technology, and insights and analytics. And to build out this frame, this capability, you start with a definition around insights and analytics. Right? We want to know, what is it that we want to measure? What is it we want to report? How do we want to use that information? From there, we can then define the process to deliver it. What cost development, cost accounting methods are we going to use to build out our cost framework? How are we going to get the data to capture, report revenues? What are the drivers? What's our hypothesis around drivers? Which technology do we use? We're obviously suggesting that the newer AI-driven and enabled technologies have the mathematics built into them so that you don't have to build out the complicated Excel spreadsheets that you can't pass from person to person because everyone has their own way of coding Excel. So that's a big problem. You need tools that your business users and your finance people can use. And by the way, there's a knock-on benefit for your people in the organization is that you're actually going to have people doing analysis as opposed to data entry. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal. Of course, you have to do it in an extremely controlled way. So if we think about the example in asset management of acquiring accounts, maintaining accounts, and potentially retiring or terminating accounts, we need to define each of these components. So we define the cost method and the costing approach for how we're going to develop that cost information, right? We're going to validate that with the analytics. We're going to have put forward a hypothesis on the business driver relationship. So again, my point about in the acquisition space, the number of new accounts and show the relationship between number of new accounts and the cost profile to do that. And by the way, it may differ by the product you offer. So we have to be sensitive to the different products you use, or perhaps the channels. Perhaps you leverage more direct sales, or maybe you leverage third-party CFAs to drive new opportunities, new clients into your organization. So it's really validating those relationships and those drivers. Once we've done that, we can then build out the analytics environment. And so Robert's going to take us through kind of a roadmap, leveraging kind of this framework and provide a little bit more specificity around some of the details.
Thank you, Greg. So let's now go into the roadmap for analytics. I mean, one of the things we want you to come home with is not only what analytics is and what it can do, but how do you do it? And this is at the core of our book, AI-Enabled Analytics for Business, is the roadmap. It's the fulcrum of the book. And there are 4 components, which is mindset, mindset, people, process, systems. Greg, could you go back one?
Sure.
Yeah. So let's start. We're going to build a roadmap. And the first part of it is what I'll call the x-axis. And it's the mindset. It's the foundation. And it's the mindset in regarding how you are going to participate in decision-making. So you can support decisions, you can contribute to decisions, you can influence decisions, or you can impact decisions. Now let's put in the y-axis. And the y-axis speaks to what we call analytics intelligence, which at the base is you report, analysis, insight, and prediction. And I'll explain those in a moment. The next, we build upon what we call personas. So we have mindset and we have a persona of a reporter. A reporter just merely reports. Here's your P&L, for example. That's a report. The reporter supports decisions. And so his analytics intelligence is that of reporting. The next step up in persona is the commentator. And the commentator adds analysis. And I'm going to let the cat out of the bag a little here. Analysis is arithmetic, like variance analysis, where we're behind budget by 5%. Analysis also is data visualization, like when you do visualize a trend. This is analysis. It is informative, and it is based on arithmetic. And the commentator contributes to decision by giving some more meaning to what the data is. The next step is insight. Now we're actually delivering something of mathematics, like a correlation, where we're correlating between one or many variables. And what we're trying to do here is influence a decision. We're trying to give insight. And as we write about in the book, insight is mathematics applied on data that tells us something we do not know that will affect our decision. And that's the advisor role. So for example, at the end of the quarter, there may be we didn't make our sales forecast pipeline target. We didn't make it. And so we call the vice president of sales and we ask, well, what happened? He says, well, 3 deals slipped to next quarter. Now that's not a reason, because 3 deals slip every quarter. It's a memo, but it's not a reason. The advisor actually digs into the data and maybe runs some correlative analysis and finds out that the reason the deal slipped was because of customer satisfaction. We had dissatisfied customers. Not only did they slip into the next quarter, they slipped out of our customer base. So the advisor is using now mathematics to provide insights to tell us something that we don't know that'll affect our decision. And finally, we come to the strategist persona. Now we're getting into predictions. For example, like we learned that unemployment is a 3-month leading indicator to sales. And sales may be down in a particular store in our region, but we see that unemployment is now descending, getting better. We have less and less unemployment. So 3 months later, hence, we would say that rather than rushing into discounts today, be calm, sales will improve because we predict such will happen. And that's now impacting decisions. So for that, we add the next axis, which are our mindset and now our systems. As reporters, we basically use Excel for the most part. We use business intelligence also, but Excel is the tool of choice. When we get to the commentator, we add in some data visualization. And then for insights, we need at least some desktop statistical tools. But if you're going to do it right, from the advisor to the strategist, you're going to need AI-enabled analytics tools that have the mathematical weight, that have the analytics intelligence, that can deep dive into data to find patterns, to make meaning of trends, to tell us predictions, to tell us not only what will happen, but how to make it happen, if you will, the predictive and the descriptive. Because there are 5 elements, 5 key questions that we have to answer in business. What happened, where it happened, why it happened, what will happen, and how to make it happen. The 2 personas of reporters and commentators are telling us what happened and where it happened. It's only when we get to the advisor are we learning why it happened, and the strategist tells us what will happen, and prescriptively, how do we make it happen? Now we'll throw in the next 2 axes, which are people and processes. Because if you think that you can rush out and buy an AI-enabled analytics tool, and you have a guy who will run that tool. We call him Bobby in the basement.
Basement.
Bobby is one guy, he's in the basement, and Johnny, who's the CEO, calls Bobby and says, hey, how's our sales going to be this quarter? And Bobby says, they're going to end the quarter great. Okay, what happens? How is that great translated into action that moves people, that moves capital into great? There's an execution that goes with great. So you need more than one man and one machine. If you'll go to the next, you need sufficient people, because remember something, the title of this slide is Roadmap to Implementing an Analytics Culture. Culture requires more than just Bobby in the basement. It requires people. It requires processes. And so we need to have sufficient people. We need to have sufficient processes to digest and utilize the analytics that we'll be developing, the outputs of those intelligently, so we can impact decision and be better business partners. Because if we don't, if we have insufficient people, then again, all we have is Bobby in the basement. And we draw a line, and our line in the sand is at the commentator. Above the commentator, we're doing analytics, because now we're actually applying mathematics on data to derive insights. Below the line, we are doing reporting, which is telling us what happened and where it happened. So this succinct chart here blends mindset, systems, people, and process as the roadmap, as the first step, if you will, as the vision, the actual roadmap of how we get to where we are today. Most of us are in the reporter and commentator role, into the advisor and strategist, where we can impact decisions and truly influence our outcomes. In other words, why wait for the future to happen? Let's plan to make the future happen. Turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Robert. That was just I've heard that a number of times. You did this, very insightful, and it takes a while to digest what we're talking about in terms of the roadmap. But Greg, if you could just go to the next slide. So some of the things that I think is important is, first of all, if we have strategies, and everyone has a strategy. As they say, Custer had a strategy. But the important thing is, can you measure whether that you are moving the needle on that strategy, whether you are executing that strategy? And so there is a relationship, particularly in cost management, that as you are taking these actions, are you quantitatively changing the outcomes or KPIs, key performance indicators? If we go to the next slide, we were trying to make the point, and I don't want to overstate the book, but that insight is based on decisions that mitigate bias. Bias is gut feel. It's okay to have a bias when I go into the supermarket and I'm trying to decide between vanilla ice cream and chocolate ice cream. But I'm trying to make an important decision. Bias can get in the way. Well, we are not biased when it comes to our decision making. Well, the truth is, and I don't want you to get upset, you are very biased when it comes to your decision making. There's a number of biases. So work with us. I want each of you to do this. I'm going to ask you a question, and as you consider the question, I want you to assume that Steve was selected at random from a representative sample. Okay. An individual has been described by a neighbor as follows. Steve is very shy and withdrawn, invariably helpful, but with little interest in people or in the world of reality. A meek and tidy soul, he has a need for order and structure and a passion for detail. The question I have for you, is Steve likely to be a librarian or a farmer? I wish we could do show of hands and and et cetera. But I can see some of you. Who thinks that Steve is the librarian? Show of hands. Who thinks that Steve is a farmer? Show of hands. Who doesn't really, the answer is Steve is likely to be a farmer. Now, why, Larry, why do you say that? You don't know Steve. Well, I do know that in the United States, there are 20 times more farmers, male farmers, than there are male librarians. So if I look at statistics,
I can vouch for that, having worked at one.
if I look at statistics will tell me that the decision is that Steve is sitting on a tractor somewhere in Iowa. And that's it. I would have thought, because by the description, it's representative of what I would have thought a librarian would be like. When we go through and make decisions, that is important. And so understanding financial, particularly financial performance, and as a former, maybe not former, each of you as financial executives, you're looking at the total financial performance of the organization. And to the extent that you can see the relationships, the statistical relationships should give you more, what's the word? Likelihood that those relationships will continue. In fact, if you really believe in statistics, which we do, hey, why don't we forecast what we think the next 3 months are going to look like? Why don't we forecast the next 12 months? Well, we don't have a crystal ball, but we have the next best thing to a crystal ball. We have past data that can influence future data. As Robert likes to say, here's a way we can actually close the barn door before the horse gets out. Well, am I trying to tell you that we are robotic? Do we process like robotic processing automation? No. We advocate the right balance between experience, business acumen, and insights from analyzing the data to come to better decisions. I watched a baseball game the other night, and there are 3 infielders on the right side of the field. My wife says to me, oh, they must know that that batter is going to pull the ball, and that's why they're over there. And I said, well, the batter's not going to bunt it down to third base because they don't do that. Why? Because statistics has told us they don't. Well, in the book Moneyball, that's how they won 112 games one year, because they understood statistics and applied it to decision making. So if we set on a course to improve our cost management structure, we need to be prepared to respond. We were asked the question the other day, if I'm doing a rolling forecast and I'm using forecasting using analytics, can I change the forecast? And the answer was absolutely. Not change the forecast without additional data, but change the forecast when additional data comes in. But by having a quantitatively calculated forecast and the input you get from the field, say from the sales organization, of what you think is going to sell the next quarter, you can level set where you think the right answer is going to be. But at least now you have an objective reference point to be able to determine whether that input from the field, which is biased, is going to hold true, or whether it's going to not come to fruition. Let's go to the next slide. Robert, you take over, then I'm going to jump back with a banking example.
Thank you, Larry. So now let's now get into real use cases, real examples of how we apply AI-enabled analytics in business. And again, where we're going to start when we think about cost management is the demand side. You know, what are we as an organization need to deliver? And this is a real life example. This is a $460 million CPG manufacturer. And what we're seeing here is for one of their tier one customers, they have about 10 tier one customers, is Walmart. And we did a forecast 1 year in advance. And we were going to back test that forecast. And this forecast with the maroon bars is in this case, we're forecasting the revenue from Walmart. And we're doing this basically from forecasting January through December. So a 12-month forecast. And the bars are showing us our percent accuracy. So we can see that from January through December, that the artificial intelligence forecast, which is the best play, one of the best plays, if you're going to start with artificial intelligence, that's a great place to start with, is that we're running between 90 and 99% accurate at the customer level. Now, by the way, we don't have time to go through this, but we did the forecast, the AI forecast down to every product at every customer. And we could do it to every product at every customer at every customer store. But this case, we're going to roll up and we're going to show you this at the particular customer level. And so we have a very high accuracy forecast. And the purple bar or purple horizontal line is what the customer, excuse me, not Walmart, but the manufacturer, what the manufacturer's target threshold was. In other words, manufacturer wanted to achieve at least an 80% accuracy. Why? Because, look, we can't plan our manufacturing, we can't plan our costs unless we have some reliability to the demand. And so the next thing I'm going to show you is now the comparison to the demand plan, the demand planning software. Because remember, enterprise software, we start at the beginning. We have ERP software, we have demand planning software. And you say, well, golly gee, Robert, isn't demand planning software doing forecasting? Well, golly gee, yes. But as I said earlier on, it can't get to the intelligence and the level that AI-enabled analytics platforms can. And what we see here is the blue bars of the demand plan software, the demand planning software's forecast over 12 months. So you can see that over 12 months, the demand planning software forecast was substantially less accurate than the AI forecast, forecasting over 12 months. And it was also substantially less accurate than the manufacturer's desired goal for forecast accuracy. And as I said in the previous slide, there's about a 35% demand error. So you could see that the demand plan software had an average of 65% accuracy or a 35% error, which is right in line with enterprise software. So what we're doing here is we're seeing real life example of applying AI and analytics to forecasting, because how are we going to control our costs if we don't know what our demand is? If we start saying, well, cut out, we don't need material, well, we won't have enough to make, or we don't need enough, we don't need as many headcount. Well, we don't have enough to deliver. So if we don't get the demand right at the onset, all the costs that are downstream from that will be wrong, and will risk not just our profits, but they'll risk our growth and our ability to grow. And there's a few things you may be thinking of now. The first thing is, wow, this is really super great results, but I'm not a data scientist. I'm not a statistician. How much data do we need? What kind of tools do we need? How do we get this thing done? How are we going to go from our spreadsheets to this? Well, in this example, again, we used Aurora Lights. It's a wonderful platform. You don't need to be a data scientist. You don't need to be a statistician. We loaded the data straight from a spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet was taken from the extract from the ERP system, which is the same data that went into the demand planning software. And we had this thing done in a weekend, essentially. Now that's fine for a proof of concept where you can get it and prove it. And usually proof of concepts can take you anywhere from a week, and I'll say 2 to 6 weeks. But you can get modern systems today like that from Aurora, which you can implement in a matter of weeks or a couple of months. And so the level of effort is low. The costs are relatively low. The ROI is enormous, and we'll get to that in a moment. But these things can be implemented with modern tools today with relatively quickly, relatively low cost, and with relatively little effort with the existing resources that you have today. The other thing that you can do, which we again write about in the book, is also outsource analytics. The second question you might have is, what does the AI do? Like, this kind of looks like a black box right now. And I want to just give you a quick primer, nothing technical, on the opportunities of using analytics. Simply put, there are 4 codependent variables when you forecast: the data, the dimensions, the formula, and the time series of data. Data is, what are we forecasting? Are we forecasting units? Are we forecasting dollars? Are we forecasting hours? Are we forecasting FTE? So what are we forecasting? That's the data. The dimension is, where are we forecasting? Are we forecasting at the product, at the store, at the customer, at the region, all of them? The formula is, what formula should we use to do the forecasting? Should we use a linear regression? Should we use a ARIMA, whatever it may be, a seasonal formula? And then the fourth is the time series. How much historical data do we use to put in the formula? Now, of those 4 codependent variables, the data and the dimension are up to the user. The user says, I want to forecast units, and I want to forecast it across all my products. Then, where the artificial intelligence comes in is, the artificial intelligence says, okay, now that I understand what data you want to forecast and the dimension or dimensions you want to forecast, now I'll pick the formulas that should be applied for each of those pieces of data at each of those dimensions. And the last thing, and this is the truly powerful thing of the artificial intelligence, especially that in Aurora's software, is choosing the time series of data. Is it 6 months? Is it 12 months? Is it 22 months? I don't know. It's up to the AI to determine that. So that's what the AI does in developing a forecast that will yield unbiased and oftentimes higher accuracy than we'll get either by doing it from a bias, like through spreadsheets, or through even demand planning software. What the user does, he chooses the data and the dimensions. But as Larry said earlier, it doesn't stop there, right? Because in order to make a truly good forecast, you need the user to tell you something about the future that isn't in the data. For example, we're closing down a manufacturing line for maintenance, we're not going to be building a certain product for the next 3 months. So even though we may be forecasting it, it's not going to be available. So those are the types of things we're going to add into the forecast to modify it, because the humans, we as humans know things that the data doesn't. And this is also a demonstration of why you can't do this in Excel. The amount of data that you need or use, and in this case, it wasn't that large, 2 years of data, but still to try to do this type of mathematics in a spreadsheet across many dimensions is going to be excessively difficult. And the year will be over by the time you forecast it. So Larry, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Robert. Again, building on what you just said, what we did, and not for this particular session, but we've been working with a major retail bank, and the question came up is, can we forecast for 2022, given the fact that in 2020 and in the prior year, there was the disruptions of COVID and other disruptive items going on in the marketplace, in our world. And so what we did is we took the data, and as Robert said, we went back with 24 months of data, a time series. And one of the things that we do as a matter of course is we do a proof, not only proof of concept, we do a best fit, where we want to see if the data and the model that we're developing is a goodness of fit. Does it fit our understanding? So what we do is we will use actual data, forecast a prior period, and then be able to compare what the forecast would have indicates and what the actual data was. And this is a good test to see how well the model is representing reality or transactional reality. And what you see on the left side is that we were achieving an incredible level of accuracy between actual transactions and forecasted transactions. And yes, we did it for a short period of time, but one of the questions that came up is, well, did you recognize the impact of COVID and all the shutdowns? And the answer was, yes, we did. We let the data explain to us what's going on. I think we were a little surprised we got it this close. But this is what the data is telling us. So why is this important? Greg, if you go to the next slide. Well, I know when I've been working with a number of financial asset management clients, I've worked with TIA CREF, I've worked with a Citigroup, I've worked with major Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, you name it, that whole section downtown, for me, downtown. One of the challenges has always been, what is the right level of staff utilization? How do we get the right resource capacity model? Not only the number of, but what roles, what skills do we need? What times do we need? What shifts do we need it? And so by having this information, we really have a better demand planning capability. And in this case, we've applied it to staff utilization. Go to the next bullet. We're always looking at not only the quality of the service, but what's the productivity? Are we achieving the level of productivity, but importantly, as we go forward, will we be able to sustain that level of productivity? And more importantly, if we are in a up recovery, will we be able to allow productivity to be able to translate to gross margin to down to the NOI level, the bottom line? Because we don't have to add resource to handle the increased volume. And certainly to look at insights, but what's the trend in the market? And what are the challenges? And in financial services, it is disruptive. Disruptors are coming out almost every other day, from online brokerage to whatever, to online banking, to mobility devices, to, you can lend money just by picking up your smartphone and putting in a couple of clicks. Let's call it PayPal. Let's call it something, whatever, Venmo, whatever the technique it is. I just want to make two additional important points here. The forecast is not only to look at what would be, but in the tool that we use, Aurora Lights, we have a predicted trend. How long do we think that trend's going to continue? And then two, it's not only the predictive trend, but can we correlate this with other events, variables, interest rate changes that the Fed announces, and what that impact may be on our customer, what that impact may be on our portfolios, our investment portfolios. So there's an awful lot of insight, but forward-looking insight. The past is the past. You can learn from it, but the future is where you can make decisions and influence change. Let's go to the next chart, please.
Okay, now I like to call this the money slide. This is the payoff. So we've gone through a couple of examples on the application of AI-enabled analytics. But what does this translate into dollars and cents? And so again, back to this CPG manufacturer, we want to take measures to reduce costs and increase sales and do that through demand planning, supply chain, inventory, and sales analytics. So let's start. Well, the first thing we did, as we reviewed just before, is we want to reduce inventory on hand and excess and obsolete inventory. And the way we do that is by having a better, more accurate demand forecast. So we can reduce those costs with better forecasting. And as you can see here, it says for every 1% decrease in demand forecast error, you get a 1.5% reduction in inventory on hand. On average, the demand forecast error was reduced by 34%, and that translated to $88 million in reduced inventory on hand and reduced E&O, excess and obsolete inventory. Once we have that better demand forecast, we can also apply more analytics, this time a Monte Carlo simulation, where we can actually squeeze more juice, if you will, out of this lemon, because rather than having static min-max capability, where in other words, when we get to a certain minimum inventory level, we buy to a maximum inventory level, and that's static throughout the year, we can use Monte Carlo simulations to make that dynamic and reduce another $2.6 million. Again, we can reduce this now again. Once we have better demand forecasting, again, we're attacking the cost side. We have all the chargebacks that happen from shortages and fill rate fines. And using this capability with predictive trends that Larry just mentioned, a better forecast, Monte Carlo simulation, we can cut that in half and reduce those shortages and fill rate fines by $7 million. And finally, we can use all the techniques that we have that we just talked about, plus using correlations to find supply chain disconnects and using correlation to find lead indicators and apply it to the revenue side and lift sales by 23 million. So all in all, if we tally this up, we have $121 million on $460 million of revenue, a 26% improvement. And so what we're showing here is that, you know, the payoff is that this is not only practical applying AI and analytics to business, but it's absolutely mandatory in today's day and age, high inflation, constrained supply, competition. You need to have better predictions that lead to better decisions for better planning, for better performance. And what we've tried to tie together here is that we've given you a voice on the value of analytics. We've given you a view to its practical implications, practical implementations, and the imperative to use it, and a framework and a roadmap to get you there. So I'll turn it back to you, Greg.
And so let me summarize what we've covered today. I think we've all experienced working, across many different organizations that the traditional approaches, which tend to be one-off, don't quite change the culture of an organization. It's a point-in-time effort, and sure, for the next 6 to 12 months, you achieve a specific cost takeout objective, but you really haven't changed the culture, and you haven't, worked to reshape the organization. Our view is that you need an analytics-driven cost management framework and capability to truly understand the business dynamics. And you've heard us talk quite a bit about mitigating bias. So to start, you have to have a hypothesis. And that is your gut, by the way. Your hypothesis, your starting hypothesis is going to be what you believe to be the business driver, revenue driver, relationship to cost, and have a view around the different views of the cost. And you validate that through these analytic techniques. And Robert has shown us, and Larry have shown us a couple of different examples of actually applying it, using it to validate, whether they're validating on the demand side or on the cost side. So you can have that complete picture to make informed decisions about where you spend your scarce resources, your expense dollars. Where do you put them? Where do you apply them? Where are they going to drive the best financial performance for the organization? So we're suggesting that you leverage a very structured approach to define the path forward, that there are tools today like Lights, and there are others that are available in the marketplace that have the mathematics built in, which is particularly important. You want the mathematics. It's not the simple arithmetic, multiply, divide, add, subtract. These are complex formulas that we're describing here that are embedded into the AI-enabled toolkit. And so you want to use those toolkits. You want to validate your hypothesis. So you're using these statistical techniques that are available to validate your hypothesis around the revenue and the expense, that relationship, what the drivers are, what pushes your cost equation around, really geared towards improving financial performance. And it really gives you the opportunity to react to the changing business conditions and have a view on your planned actions and what the results of those planned actions. When we talk about forecasting looking forward, you can set about to have a series of planned actions, and you can project out what they're going to be, and you can react to them over time. And with that, Aaron, I'd like to turn it back to you and say thank you.
Thank you, Greg and Larry and Robert. Some great points, and I think just really starting to scratch the surface.